Julie Dart, and Stephanie Slater. In July 1991, a criminal named Michael Sams kidnapped a woman named Julie Dart and took her to a remote warehouse in Nottinghamshire. With a sinister plan in mind, he chained his victim and forced her to write a ransom note, demanding £140,000 from her boyfriend. But Sams never intended to release her, and shortly after this incident, he murdered Dart. 7 months later, in January 1992, Sams acted again, and this time he kidnapped Stephanie Slater. He kept Slater for 8 days, in a coffin-like box, under horrific conditions and at gunpoint. Once again, a heavy ransom of £175,000 was demanded. But unlike the previous case, after the ransom was paid by Slater's employer, she was released alive and without any serious physical injury. John Paul Getty III. In July 1973, John Paul Getty III, the 16-year-old grandson of the famous oil billionaire, was kidnapped in Italy. The kidnappers demanded a $17 million ransom for his release. But the response from his grandfather, J. Paul Getty, was shocking. He categorically refused to pay the ransom. Months passed, and negotiations reached a deadlock. Then, real terror occurred. The kidnappers sent the boy's severed ear to a local newspaper. This extreme action finally forced the grandfather to act. But even then, he paid under specific conditions. Only the maximum amount deductible for tax purposes was paid, and the rest was loaned to his son, John Paul Getty III's father, at 4% interest. After 5 months in captivity, Getty III was released, but he had suffered deep physical and psychological damage. He turned to drugs, and at the age of 25, he suffered a severe stroke that resulted in paralysis, loss of speech, and almost complete blindness. He died 4 decades later, at the age of 54. Jayme Closs. In October 2018, Jake Patterson, a 21-year-old man who had apparently become obsessed with 13-year-old Jayme Closs after seeing her on the school bus, broke into her family's home at midnight. He shot Jayme's father in the back door to clear the way for entry, and then stormed inside the house. Jayme and her mother, Denise, who had hidden in the bathroom, were the next victims. Patterson killed the mother, and then bound Jayme with tape and took her away from the crime scene. He brought the teenage girl to a remote cabin, where he kept her captive for 88 days, often confining her in a tight space under the bed. The captivity lasted until January 2019, when Jayme finally managed to escape in Patterson's absence and reach safety. This heroic escape led to Patterson's immediate arrest. He was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Amber Hagerman. The tragic disappearance of Amber Hagerman, a 9-year-old girl from Texas, became a milestone in the history of child safety in the United States. In January 1996, Amber was kidnapped while riding her bicycle in her grandparents' neighborhood. Although extensive searches began immediately, 4 days later, her body was found next to a creek. Her killer was never identified or arrested. This shocking event exposed a severe weakness in the rapid alert system for child abductions. In response to this tragedy, a system was designed, named in honor of Amber Hagerman, the Amber Alert. It was quickly adopted across the United States, and later in other countries as well. Madeleine McCann. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann in 2007 became one of the most controversial international kidnapping cases. This 3-year-old British girl went missing mysteriously while on a family vacation in a coastal area of Portugal. Her siblings were asleep at the time. Her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, who had gone to a nearby restaurant for dinner, returned at 10 p.m. to check on the children, and eventually discovered that Madeleine was missing. The case received extensive media coverage, placing the McCann family at the center of global attention. Their behavior was closely scrutinized, and they were even mistakenly accused by the Portuguese police. But these accusations were later completely dismissed. Years later, in 2020, German authorities identified Christian Bruckner, who was in the area at the time, as the prime suspect. Although there is strong evidence, such as CCTV footage and cellmate confessions, no direct charge against him has yet been proven. Elizabeth Smart. In June 2002, Elizabeth Smart, a 14-year-old girl from Utah, was kidnapped from her bedroom in Salt Lake City. Her kidnappers, Brian David Mitchell, who called himself a religious prophet, and his wife, Wanda Barzee, took her to the surrounding mountains and held her captive for 9 months. During this time, Elizabeth was subjected to daily abuse and brainwashing based on Mitchell's delusions, and was forced to obey his strict rules. In March 2003, an ordinary citizen who was watching the crime show, America's Most Wanted, happened to spot Elizabeth walking with Mitchell and Bar Z on the streets of Sandy, Utah. The alert viewer immediately notified the police, and Elizabeth was ultimately rescued. After her rescue, Elizabeth Smart became a powerful advocate for victims' rights and worked to reform kidnapping-related laws. Adam Walsh. The tragedy of Adam Walsh in July 1981 changed not only a family, but the entire American community. This 6-year-old boy went missing while he was at a Sears store in Hollywood, Florida, with his mother. She left him briefly alone in the store's video game section, and when she returned, Adam had disappeared. Extensive searches led to a bitter outcome. Just 2 weeks later, his remains were found in a drainage canal at some distance from the place he was kidnapped. The case was never fully solved. Although the notorious serial killer, Augustus, confessed to this crime, he later recanted his confession, and there was no strong evidence to prove the charge. This uncertainty continues to this day. Charles Augustus Lindbergh, Jr. The kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's son in March 1932, often referred to as the crime of the century, shocked and horrified the world. The 2-year-old child of the famous aviator and his wife, Anne Morrow, was taken directly from his crib in his bedroom. The kidnapper gained access to the child's room by placing a homemade ladder at the window, and after abducting the baby, left a ransom note. This event became an unprecedented media disaster and drew global attention. Although the family agreed to pay the ransom, hopes were destroyed forever when the boy's body was discovered less than 5 miles from the Lindbergh home in May. Investigations revealed that the child had been killed shortly after the abduction. This tragedy led to the passage of the Lindbergh Law, which made interstate kidnapping a federal crime and had a lasting impact on U.S. law and police procedures. The Chowchilla Kidnapping. In July 1976, one of the boldest and most horrifying mass kidnappings in California history occurred. 3 armed men attacked a school bus carrying 26 children and its driver in the Chowchilla area. These children, returning from a summer camp, suddenly found themselves in the hands of kidnappers, who transported them to an underground shelter in a rock and gravel quarry. The kidnappers intended to demand a large ransom. All 3 attackers were arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment, but all were eventually released on parole after decades in prison.